Have you ever had the feeling that life is moving so fast that you're not entirely sure that you actually agreed to the pace? There's somewhere along the way that the world started to say, scroll, hurry up, do more, achieve more, and yet something inside you is quietly whispering, please slow down. Hi, I'm Lucy and welcome back to Beautifully Unfinished. It's the podcast about finding common ground with others navigating the next chapter of their life. A dear friend sent me a message not long after I started this podcast, and she said, you know what, I've just heard something. I was doing some work and I was listening to the TV and I heard this. You've got to do a podcast on it. I can't remember it word for word, but it was something along the lines of, your body and your soul are asking for you to pause, but the world is telling you to scroll and hurry up. How true is that? It feels like we're on this treadmill, and if we slow down, or worse, if we stop, we might just fall off. And yet there's that whisper, that quiet voice within us, gently saying, pause. But everywhere around us, the noise says the opposite. It says scroll, hurry up, do more, achieve more, keep going. In fact, just today I was scrolling on Facebook and I came across something that made me stop in my tracks. It was a little saying that said, you live once. And then below it said something that really caught my attention. That's not true. You die once, but you live every single day. And when I read it, I paused, because how true is that? It's not that we live once, we live every single day. And the real question becomes, how do we choose to live those days? Life has become so busy, so noisy, so full of pressure and expectation that sometimes it feels like we're all just trying to keep up with the pace that nobody actually chooses. And lately, I've realized something. There's a part of me that doesn't want to keep rushing anymore. In fact, I'm exhausted. Or maybe, if I'm really honest, there's a part of me that's also a little afraid to slow down, because by slowing down means I might have to face my own stuff, and that's not always easy. But still there's this pull, a quiet desire to stop for a moment and ask a very simple question. What do I actually want to be? What do I want to be doing? Because something interesting happens when you reach a certain age and stage in your life. You suddenly realize that the time ahead of you is probably a lot less than the time you've already lived. And that actually changes everything. It reminds me of a friend who once described it so perfectly. She said, at some point in your life, you realize that the runway is getting shorter. And if the runway is getting shorter, then maybe that's the cue for us to start flying. To start living a life that feels true to who you actually are. Because at some point, if you really want to feel free in your life, the only way to feel free is you have to start being me. You have to start being yourself. Not who people think you should be, not the people pleaser, not the version of yourself that's constantly trying to keep everyone else happy. Not the cautious voice in your head, the one that says, you have to behave, you have to stay within your line, stay on your side of the road. But the real you, the one that wants to make a difference in the world. The one that wants to have the belly laugh. The one that wants to curl up in front of a fire with a really good book. Or even better, comforting arms around you. Although I'm not entirely sure if George Clooney is available at the moment, but one can always hope. The you that wants to write that book. Play the piano, finally master the F chord on the guitar. The you that wants to be fearless, not reckless, but fearless. Fearless of judgment, fearless of what people might think of you, and fearless of finally doing the things that feel true to who you are. Because one thing that age gives us is perspective. And perhaps a little bit of freedom. There's a strange kind of confidence that comes with getting older. You begin to realize you can actually get away with a lot more than you once thought. And that the rules you spent years following may not have been quite as rigid as you once believed. And you start to realize something too. You realize that peace becomes incredibly valuable, almost like a sanctuary, something you begin to protect quite carefully. Because when life has become noisy, busy, complicated for long enough, you start to realize that the quiet moments, for what they really are, not emptiness, but peace, the kind of peace that anxious, heart-racing anxiety begins to settle and you finally have a moment to breathe. And perhaps part of growing older is learning to guard that peace, learning that you don't have to say yes to everything, that you don't have to explain every decision, that sometimes the most powerful word in the English language is simply no. And no is actually a complete sentence. No explanation required, just a quiet, grounded decision to protect your time, your energy, and your inner peace. And perhaps that's a realization that came to me yesterday morning in the most unexpected way. My little grandson Conrad was visiting. He's nearly 2 years old, such a cute little poppet, a delightful little human who only says a handful of words but somehow has already decided that I'm Nana, despite the fact that I've always been referred to and am called Granny. He is also affectionately known in our family as Boy. It was a name given to him by his big sister McKenna, who is now 5. And I have to admit, I secretly hope that the name Boy stays with him for many years. It just is so cute, especially when it comes out of McKenna's mouth. And of course, when you're with a little 2-year-old, the world more or less comes to a complete standstill. There's absolutely no point in trying to accomplish anything on your to-do list. So there I was, middle of the week, middle of the day, sitting on this tiny little kiddie chair outside by the sandpit, being served endless cups of tea made completely of sand. And Conrad would carefully scoop up the sand into the little cup and present it to me as if it was the finest brew imaginable. Then he would dash across the garden to the bird bath, fill a little cup with water and bring it back, sloshing it everywhere, which of course meant in a few seconds he needed to return to the bird bath again and again and again. And soon the ball caught his attention. So now we were throwing the ball and kicking the ball across the lawn. There was so much chatter coming from Granny. Mostly the word ball was coming from Conrad, but somehow the conversation felt perfectly complete. Then there was a little snail making its way across the lawn. Completely distracted my little companion, he crouched down to investigate this tiny little creature with enormous curiosity. I soon realized that it might be wise for Granny to step in before that curiosity turned into something a little more questionable. So the snail was quietly rescued and relocated to a safer part of the garden. And while that small drama was unfolding, something else happened. I stopped. I paused. I looked around my little garden with new eyes. The weaver birds were chatting loudly at their reflections in the mirrors. The sunbirds were darting in and out the bird bath. There was a bee quietly minding its own business on one of the roses. And the garden itself looked beautiful. Roses of many colours, the smell of fresh grass bright from the recent rain, and the flower beds full and alive. And sitting there on that tiny chair next to the sandpit, I realised something quite simple. It was probably time I stopped rushing long enough to actually smell the roses. The morning continued at this gentle pace that only a 2-year-old can set. And soon it was time for my little boy's nap. So I was making a cup of tea for him as well, although this version came in a bottle rather than a teacup. And after all the excitement of sand, tea, bird baths, balls, snails, and my little man was tired and ready for a rest. And truth be told, so was Granny. So we climbed onto my bed together, book in hand, and he listened for a few minutes. Then he curled himself up, close to his fleece blanket, and gently started stroking his cheek. So sweet, so innocent, and so simple. Before long, we both drifted into a quiet midday nap. And in that small, ordinary moment, the world felt exactly as it should be. Slow, peaceful, uncomplicated. For me lately, that realization has been something very, very simple. Joy. I want to find joy again. Not the forced kind, not the tick off the box kind, but the kind, the real kind that comes from being fully present in your own life. Because if I'm honest, right now, my days feel like never-ending lists of things to be done. And they're never done at the end of the day. I wake up with a list, I go to bed with a list, and somewhere in between those lists, life can start feeling exhausting, stressful, hectic beyond measure. And that quiet whisper inside me keeps asking, what if the answer isn't to do more? What if the answer is to pause, to breathe, to listen, and to start becoming your own cheerleader again? Because perhaps the part of learning to pause is also learning to appreciate the simple things again. Something as small and as ordinary as a breath. Because every breath we take is a quiet reminder that we're still here, we're still living, we're still able to choose how we show up in the world. And every breath we take is also a gentle reminder that somewhere in the world, someone is taking their very last breath. Which is perhaps why it matters so much that we don't boldly rush blindly through our days without noticing the simple gift of being alive. Because if we do, it's almost like an injustice to those who would give anything for just one more day, one more moment, and one more breath. So perhaps today the invitation is this. And it's an instruction to myself too, to slow down, to appreciate every breath we take, to be grateful, to be gracious. Because perhaps the next chapter of our life isn't about proving anything. Perhaps it's about finally allowing ourselves to live in a way that feels true. Because we only die once, but we live every single day. And perhaps being beautifully unfinished simply means we're still discovering who we are. Thank you so much for joining me today. If this episode resonated with you, I'd love it if you'd like, follow and subscribe. It just helps me keep going. And until next time, next week, next Thursday, remember, we are all still a little beautifully unfinished. I'll see you next week, I hope.